Okay, we are now live on our Facebook feed. Welcome everyone to River Reflections with Colorado River Alliance. This is our latest episode in our virtual speaker series. Today we're going to be talking about blue-green algae in Austin waterways. And I'm joined by some experts on the topic. We have Brent Bellinger, Dr. Brent Bellinger, with Watershed Protection Department at City of Austin. He is the lead reservoir ecologist. Also joining us from the Watershed Protection Department is Liz Johnston, Environmental Program Coordinator. And we also have Dr. Schonna Manning, who's a research assistant professor at University of Texas at Austin, who's done some extensive research on this topic today. So thank you so much to our panelists for joining us. They're gonna teach us all about blue-green algae today, which we might have heard about in the news last summer and this summer. You might have seen it yourself down at Lady Bird Lake here in Austin. So we're gonna get some questions answered about this algae. The last 15 minutes of our panel or episode here is going to be open to audience questions. So if you think of a question for our panelists at any time, go ahead and drop it in the comments here on Facebook, and we will get to your questions towards the end. So without further ado, my first question is for Dr. Schonna Manning. Can you tell us what is blue-green algae? How is it different from other algae that people might see?
Well, blue-green algae are actually a type of cyanobacteria. So cyanobacteria are related to other types of bacteria, but they are photosynthetic, and they were the first organisms on the planet to actually evolve oxygen as part of the photosynthetic process, roughly 3.5 billion years ago. So without cyanobacteria or blue-green algae, we would not have the atmosphere, the oxygenic atmosphere that we do have today that supports all of the life that we have today.
So in that respect, we should be thanking some of this algae. But that being said, we've heard that it can be harmful. So how does this algae produce toxins, or when does it become harmful and toxic in the water?
That's a good question. So there are lots of different types of cyanobacteria. Not all of them are known to produce toxins, but many of them do produce different suites of compounds that can be toxic to nervous systems, livers, other types of cells like red blood cells. So they generally produce these toxins, and they're maintained inside the cells. And generally, those particular compounds make the algae less palatable to other organisms in the water, so that they're not going to be grazed upon as being, part of the dinner plate for other organisms in the water.
And can the toxins only form in freshwater, like our lakes here in Austin, or do we also see this down on the coast at all?
Well, algae are everywhere, cyanobacteria are everywhere, and the compounds are going to be ubiquitous across these different freshwater and marine and everything in between. So they really run the freshwater to brackish to marine and even hypersaline conditions. So you can expect to find cyanobacteria almost everywhere, and you can also expect to find some of these compounds, some of these noxious compounds, depending on the organisms that are present in these locations.
Gotcha. So it's showing up a lot of places now. My next question is for Liz Johnston. When was this toxic algae first discovered in the Austin area?
So that was last year in early August, when unfortunately a citizen notified us that her dog had died after swimming at Red Blood Isle in Austin. Prior to the invasion of zebra mussels, Lady Bird Lake did experience harmful algae blooms, but of a different sort. So the types of algae blooms that Lady Bird Lake had were called planktonic blooms, meaning they were kind of single-celled organisms floating in the water. The type of algae bloom that happened last year was what we call a benthic bloom. So it's algae that grows on the bottom of the sediment in the lake, and then it kind of dies and forms these cohesive mats floating on the top. And so that was not ever really a problem in Lady Bird Lake until we noticed it last year.
And this question, I have it here for Schonna, but if anyone else wants to jump in as well, how does it form, or what are the main causes that would cause the bacteria or the algae to produce toxins?
Well, as Liz mentioned, a lot of these cyanobacteria were originally in the benthos. It means that they're at the bottom of the water column, at the anchored to the bottom of the lake, and essentially they got disrupted and got released, and then they floated up to the top. Now it's thought that these compounds are being produced all the time in the algae, again, to deter other grazers, but there are sometimes different stressors in the environments like nutrients and lights and other organisms that might want to eat them that might increase their toxin content over time.
So it's kind of like a defense mechanism for the
Absolutely.
algae to survive. Gotcha. So going back to how it's harmful effects, I know none of us are veterinarians here, but Liz brought up that, people became aware of this and it kind of started buzzing in headlines because of those incidents last summer where people's dogs were harmed by the algae in the water. What are the effects of the algae on, the nervous system or human bodies, animal bodies? How does that defense mechanism actually work?
So I can go ahead and take that. Yeah, so essentially this is a central nervous system antagonist, and what's happening is the individual, it doesn't matter whether they're going to be a furry canine or a taller human, anybody that has a central nervous system can be affected by these neurotoxins. It's all about dosage and those effects. So essentially what happens upon ingestion of these cells that then release the compounds into the stomach, and then through absorption, usually starts with respiratory failure and then central nervous system death over time. And that's what happened with the canines last year, reportedly.
Gotcha. So how likely is it that humans would be affected by the algae if we're in the water?
It can be very likely. I mean, again, we have central nervous systems just like canines. So if we were to ingest enough water and have accidental exposure to some of the cells and digest those in our stomachs, we would have a release of compounds, absorption into our system, and then an attack on the central nervous system. It's all about dosage. So of course, with the dogs being smaller, they're getting contact with the algae and they're ingesting a bit more, whereas humans are a bit more cautious about what they're going to put in their bodies, you would hope. But so their exposure is going to be much lower. We've advised citizens to rinse off if they've happened to get into the water at all, just to try to minimize any type of exposure that they could have had. But it's all about dosage. So it'd take much more exposure to actually impact a human than it would a canine.
Gotcha.
Can I just interject as well that there haven't been any reported deaths in North America from anatoxin A in a human.
Gotcha. Thank you for that, Liz. I'm going to jump to a question for Dr. Bellinger here, just since we're talking about, how can this affect humans in the water? Does this affect our drinking water at all? For those who don't know, we do get 100% of our drinking water here in Austin from the Texas-Colorado River, specifically Lake Austin. So is there any chance that we could be affected by the toxins in our drinking water?
Well, fortunately, right now, we have not seen any toxins showing up in the raw water or in the treated water. Again, the blooms, the events that we had last year occurred on Lady Bird Lake. So this is downriver from the drinking water intakes that are on Lake Austin. The water quality, the water chemistry, sediment chemistry are different between the two reservoirs. In the past, there have been some blooms, as Liz had mentioned, some planktonic blooms of cyanobacteria. But when Watershed Protection and Austin Water tested and screened the water, no toxins were determined. So again, as Schonna had mentioned earlier, cyanobacteria, there's a lot of species, they don't always produce toxins. Even those species that may have that capacity may not always be triggered to do so. So at this time, we are not seeing any adverse effects to our drinking water supply. And this type of bloom, this benthic bloom, is also less likely to impact the drinking water supply. Just the nature of kind of how localized this is, the amount of mass that's actually in the water. It's different than what you would see, for example, in Lake Erie, Lake Okeechobee, in these other lakes where they have these large planktonic blooms that affect tens to hundreds of square miles. And then you're getting in your drinking water intake pipes a large influx of living and dying cells that are releasing these toxins into the water. So there's very different dynamics that come into play to impact the drinking water supply.
All right. And just to follow up to that, you mentioned, and this is a good point, that we're seeing the toxins in Lady Bird Lake downstream from where our water is pumped from. Can one algae bloom travel very far? Can it affect the water downstream from us in the river? And
that's a great question. Obviously, these cohesive mats or even cells in the plankton, they can be mobilized by large discharge, by wind movement, so they could travel downstream. What you'd probably get though, as they're for example going over or through the Longhorn Dam, is the dissolution of those mats, breaking that material apart, and quite a bit of dilution. Again, we don't quite know what level, how much dosage it takes to impact a dog. But as you're going down river, as you're mixing and breaking apart those mats, you're getting that dilution effect occurring.
Gotcha. And just thinking about, why we're seeing it last summer and this summer, and something that I've heard that can either make the bloom worse or cause it in the first place is a lack of moving water. So is that correct that we see an increase in these blooms when we haven't had a lot of rainfall and there's just not water breaking up the algae blooms?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the factors. This is well known, the ecology for cyanobacteria, that they prefer very low turbulence in the water for the plankton. These mats that are growing on the bottom, if they're exposed to a large flow, they could be scoured. But as was mentioned earlier by Schonna, you also need high temperatures. You need a solid supply of nutrients. So you need multiple factors in place for a bloom to really take off.
Gotcha. And I'm going to skip to Liz for this question. I just feel like we're kind of moving in this direction. Is there anything that we as residents can do to prevent these blooms from happening?
Yes, there's a lot of things that people can do to help prevent algae blooms, whether this type or any type of algae bloom. So, we all live in the Colorado River watershed, and what people can do in the uplands to help stabilize the entire watershed is realize how we are all connected. And so there's some obvious things like don't over fertilize your lawn so that nutrients don't flow into your nearby creek, which will cause algae blooms in the creek or make its way into the receiving body of water, whether it be the lake or Colorado River. Keep your pet waste scooped. Obviously, those are two things that people can do that are pretty easy. Another thing that people don't necessarily always consider is treating the stormwater on their site. So installing rain gardens, stormwater cisterns that slowly drain over time. These are all things that help improve the hydrology of the creek, which will then have positive effects in the entire watershed. And even Austin Water has rebates for those. So if you're interested in a rain garden or cistern, you can Google that and get some money back. But there's lots of things that people can do. We're all connected hydrologically.
Yes, thank you for that point. That's something we talk a lot about at the Alliance is how our bodies of water are not disconnected. If you live next to a creek and your fertilizer goes into that creek, it's going to end up in the Texas-Colorado River. If you live in Austin, and our lovely lakes where we're seeing these algae blooms are all a part of that river. So that's a great point. We got to take care of the water around us. And this is just one reason to consider that. So we have the Watershed Protection Department here in Austin, which has been monitoring the water and collecting samples since last summer. I believe that's correct, when we first saw this as an issue. Brent, can you tell us a little bit about the monitoring that y'all do, how often these samples are collected, and when you know this is something that we need to send to the lab?
Yeah, this is actually something, and I mean, I've been with Watershed Protection for about 6.5 years now. And as a municipality, the monitoring program that they have, not just for the reservoirs, but citywide, for the wetlands, for the creeks, is absolutely amazing. I mean, this is rivals, state and even some federal programs. So I walked into an amazing situation where there was actually the monitoring of the reservoirs has been going on for about 20 years. So there was a robust history of data available that we are currently looking at and mining to determine, kind of what happened and what changed last year. So we have 3 monitoring sites on Lake Austin, on Lady Bird Lake, that we go out to bi-monthly to monthly, depending on the season. And we collect a suite of water quality parameters. We do invertebrate sampling, we do habitat assessments, because all of these attributes of the reservoirs kind of give a hint and tell us a story about how healthy the ecosystem is. In terms specifically to the harmful algae blooms, that did start last year after we had the report of the canine deaths. We went out weekly to bi-weekly to sites that are known to be popular off-leash areas for dogs. So we wanted to make sure that in those areas, kind of like monitoring beaches for E. coli, we wanted to get data at these points where people were most likely to interact with the water, with their pets. So we had that routine monitoring going on, as well as collecting additional water quality samples. We've refined kind of that monitoring scheme over the winter. We started at the beginning of June this year, deploying sensors, collecting samples, keeping an eye on the conditions, water temperature, nutrients, looking for signs of the proliferation of these mats. And as soon as we started seeing the mats, kind of at the, what was it? I think end of June, Schonna, was when the first samples came in. And we actually had, I believe, 2 or 3 weeks of sampling where no toxins were measured. And then, again, there was the switch was flipped, and toxins were detected in the mats. At that point, we did more public outreach and education. We've continued to do our weekly monitoring so that we can track the abundance of the toxins in the mats to get a handle on what species are there. And so we can kind of tell this story and fill in this picture of the boom and bust dynamics of a bloom in these reservoirs for future prediction and hopefully mitigation.
Great. Yeah, that sounds pretty thorough. So we thank Watershed Protection and UT Austin for this collaboration, testing and monitoring these samples. I have a question for Liz. While Watershed is doing these things and monitoring the water, what can residents do to keep themselves and their pets safe while we're near the water?
Right. Well, any open body of water is going to bear risks, whether it's related to a harmful algae bloom or not. There's bacteria that you need to be concerned with. There's other dangers in the water. So I think just being aware of what the conditions are like, noticing if there's any changes. Don't let your dogs or kids play around with bundles of algae. I know I have a daughter and she just loves playing with algae. Like, yes, I tell her, don't touch that. It's usually green algae, but not the toxic kind, but still I tell her, just don't do that. If you do get in the water on Lady Bird Lake, swimming is illegal. It has been illegal since the 1950s. So that's not changed with this. We do allow people to kayak and paddleboard and enjoy the reservoir. But if you do fall in or have contact with it, like Dr. Schonna Manning mentioned earlier, rinse off quickly. Take a shower afterwards. Don't get into the water when you have an open wound, for example, because even if the algae itself isn't a problem, there could be bacteria as well. So just be aware of what you're getting yourself into and take a shower afterwards.
Gotcha. I have another follow-up question for Schonna. In your research that you've done on this topic, have you come across any groups or any research that lends itself to eradicating these toxins? I mean, do we know of any ways to get rid of these toxins in our water?
There are not very many easy ways of going about this. And in fact, a lot of people tend to just throw a bunch of chemicals at the algae to make the eyesore go away. So once they don't see it, they don't think that there's any dangers inherent with the waterway. But algae do a pretty good job of maintaining their toxins inside their cells, and that's why we're not seeing a lot of these toxins released into the water column, which is really good. But when we do have a die-off event of these algae, then they will start to release some of those compounds, and hopefully, as we get closer to the end of the end of this bloom, this proliferation, we will start to see less and less toxin inside those materials. The real I guess solution here is to kind of let it go downstream, let it degrade, let it oxidize, because ultimately if we throw a bunch of chemicals at these algae, essentially they're just going to release all these compounds into the waterways, which is going to cause bigger problems for our water quality, even though it's not our drinking water source. But there are people downstream that we are thoughtful of, and a lot of people, say like the Army Corps of Engineers, other groups have used say industrial grade hydrogen peroxide. They'll throw that at a lake to try to eradicate the eyesore. But what they've unintentionally done is that they burst all the algae open, releasing all these particular compounds. And especially like Brent says, like Lake Okeechobee, Lake Erie, these are microcystin dominated lakes. So I have microcystin, which is a liver toxin. And so these compounds have a very long fate in the water column and the sediments. And so it's kind of one of those forever compounds if we can't flush them down. Now, we don't have microcystins present as of now. We have these antitoxins, but essentially they're fairly labile. And as soon as they're downstream, we see that the danger is mostly gone until next year.
Gotcha. And just to kind of talk more on that. So the main difference between the toxins that we're seeing in Lady Bird Lake versus other lakes in the country that you mentioned is that those toxins are more harmful, how they affect our bodies, or what's kind of the main difference there between their issues and ours?
I call them, they're very different issues. So, microcystis is predominant in Lake Erie and Lake Okeechobee. These are cyanobacteria that are mostly in the plankton. And what you don't see these acute death cases that are usually caused by antitoxins. Usually they're longer term, chronic and acute liver disease and liver cancers around those particular regions. Again, we have not detected microcystins in our reservoirs here yet. Mostly it's antitoxin. Antitoxins are VFDF, very fast death factors. So we're seeing these strong aggressive compounds on the central nervous system. And again, most of these compounds are maintained inside those cells, again, as a deterrent towards grazing, but they can be released if they are grazed upon, or again, if the bloom senesces and essentially breaks everything open and releasing those compounds.
Gotcha. Is there any way for someone to identify harmful algae versus, non-harmful algae just with your eyes if you're down at the lake and we don't want to be terrified of any algae bloom that we see. So is there any way to differentiate between them?
Not by the naked eye. Of course, you need a microscope to be able to zoom in and see who is there. But, I would really trust your eyes and your nose when you're approaching any water body. If it smells bad, if it looks kind of scuzzy, it's likely bad. You won't want to get in there or let your pets in there. So just a little bit of common sense on if it smells bad, looks bad, don't do it.
Gotcha. That's pretty solid advice for water safety. Last question, I'm trying to remember who this was for. I think this one was for you as well, Schonna, but feel free anyone to jump in on this. Since we know that droughts are increasing in our area of Texas year after year, there seems to be a correlation with, our stagnant water not receiving a lot of rainfall and an increase in algae blooms. So can we expect to see this issue every summer as droughts increase and that kind of spurs the toxic algae?
I would say largely yes, and based on a longer term study that one of my former graduate students performed that also worked with the city of Austin, looking at the past long drought that we had in the hill country, we did see with increased conductivity, higher concentrations of nutrients in the water, the high temperatures, the low flows, that did encourage higher cyanobacterial loads in the highland lakes, and all of that's going to flow downstream to Austin. So there's likely a good chance that event may have started seeding more cyanobacteria, encouraging them to thrive in our area. So we're not expecting them to go away. That's why we have this monitoring program in place. So we kind of know what was happening upstream, and we're getting a really good handle of what's happening here in the local reservoir so that we can have a better idea of how to predict and hopefully prevent, some of the toxic effects. But essentially just trying to keep the community aware and keep them all safe.
Gotcha. Thank you. We are starting to get some questions from the audience here. So if it's all right with y'all, I'm going to continue with these. One that we got kind of going along with water safety and who should be cautious. I'll direct this to Liz. Should anglers practice caution when we're down at the river fishing?
On the river, I think the same advice I gave previous applies. It's by and large safe to get in the water. I wouldn't put my head under the water necessarily, especially if you're really close to Lady Bird Lake, but it's safe to fish. And just rinse off when you're done, because it's at that point, if you're down in the river, it's probably, as Brent mentioned, diluted by then. And so the larger question is there any bacteria in the water that you would need to be concerned with? So I think just common sense water safety applies. Be aware if it's stagnant and mucky, go somewhere else where the water's flowing faster.
Would you say that it's relatively safe to consume fish or other things that you catch near an algae bloom?
I have not heard of any bioaccumulation in fish. They don't tend to eat that type of algae because the whole point of having toxins in the cells is to deter eating of the algae. So I would assume that it's safe, but that's something that I suppose the state would have to weigh in on, whether or not there's any fishing advisories, and there aren't any fishing advisories currently.
Gotcha. Thank you. We also got a question. Is there any correlation between our algae issue and the other really hot topic about our water, zebra mussels? Is there, these are both issues for us in our water currently, but is there any correlation between the two? I don't know, anybody who wants to speak on that?
Brent, you want to go ahead?
Sure. The research is kind of leaning that direction, that the zebra mussels and their impacts on the ecosystem. They're considered an ecosystem engineer because of how they so dramatically alter water clarity, the amount of organic matter and nutrients in the water column, translocating all of that material down to the benthos. And given that we're talking about the proliferation of cyanobacteria growing on the surface sediments, it's very hard to disentangle how zebra mussels, likely help facilitate that by increasing water clarity, by altering and feeding more nutrients down to the bottom sediments. So I feel that it's pretty safe to say that they have played a role in that. To what degree and magnitude is still being determined, but it's hard to discredit that and their role in this.
Okay, interesting. Question for either Liz or Brent. How is Watershed Protection Department educating the public during COVID? Has there been any change in how you're letting the public know about this issue?
Yes, there's a really great dashboard that Brent has worked hard on with some of our other staff, graphics and GIS folks. So there, you can go to, I'll put it in the chat later, but if you Google City of Austin algae, it should pop right up. There's a dashboard that you can check out and see what results have come in from Dr. Manning's lab, what the temperature is, what the flow rate is, and what our risk level is.
Perfect. Yeah, that's a great resource.
And we also have, just to build on that, working with PARD, Parks and Recreation Department, our education team, and others, there is permanent signage around Lady Bird Lake, especially at the popular off-leash dog areas. There are pictures. Again, it's tough to tell with the naked eye what might be a toxic mat, but cyanobacteria are somewhat distinguishable relative to other algae. So if you start to see things on the water that look like what's on these pictures on this permanent signage, that's a good idea, to avoid interacting with those spots. As well as there was, once we had a positive toxin hit, temporary signage was put out warning people of that heightened risk that toxins were in fact detected beyond the other educational materials. So there's been a lot of coordination amongst departments and with the groups within Watershed to get information out there and make that accessible to people through different media.
Right, and if any conditions change or anything new comes up, our social media group is real quick to post on Facebook and Twitter and update the website. So we're trying to get the information out as much as we can through social media.
Awesome. And we can drop the links for those resources in the comment section on here so people can go back and check that out for themselves. Have another question here. So we've only seen the toxins in Lady Bird Lake. If that's correct. We have a question about if we suspect that the toxic algae is also present in our urban creeks. Is that a possibility, or is that something that is also tested in the creeks around Austin?
As of right now, we're not testing the creeks. We're just testing the main body of water of Lady Bird Lake and any of the effluents that are coming into Lady Bird Lake. But it's certainly possible that, again, those other minor creeks could be accumulating nutrients and supporting the algal growth as well.
Gotcha. So probably best to practice safety in our creeks as well.
Yes, especially for, if there's a creek that has, large stagnant pool areas, that would kind of more mimic a lake. We're in that time of year. Granted, we just got rain this week, but it had been very dry. So you probably only have some remnant pools left over. The other parts of the creeks, if they can maintain flow, if they can maintain cooler water, it's less likely that they would have those kind of blooms. But as the summer progresses and you get this pooling of water and things going stagnant, there's always that chance.
Yeah, we recommend that people avoid stagnant pools and look for clear, clean, flowing water. So if the water isn't flowing clear, then I wouldn't let my dog play in it.
Gotcha. It's a good rule of thumb. Another question we have, do y'all know if the state provides information on toxic algae blooms for people that are living in other areas of Texas?
I mean, I know that they put out warnings, coastal warnings when there's issues there, but as far as other reservoirs I'm not entirely sure.
So I've worked with Texas Parks and Wildlife over the past couple of decades now. One of the biggest bloom forming algae that we have in Texas before we had these proliferations here in Austin was golden algae known as Promesium parvum. And there's a website through Texas Parks and Wildlife Department that does talk about some of the toxic algae that are present in Texas reservoirs. And we've detected golden algae in almost every single river in Texas. And so, you know, there are harmful algae around. There are at the coastline, like we do get Corynea brevis, the thing that causes red tide. We get Oreo umbra, some different types of algae that can create some issues. But there is a website. It's just not as populated as I would think. We have so many more algae now that I think we need to have more education on what's all out there.
Yeah, very good point about that. Do we know if other communities upstream are working together or coordinating to, well, in general, prevent pollutants from spreading downstream to us? But, are there any other agencies that y'all know of that are working to prevent toxic algae blooms upstream from us?
Yeah, the Lower Colorado River Authority staff we've been working closely with them. And I know that they have programs to reduce nutrient input into the Highland Lakes and all along the Colorado River. They've just got a very large basin to work with. But yes, they're very interested in that. And they have a really good website as well about harmful algae. So in addition to our algae website, you could also give people the LCRA's algae website as well, because it's got a lot of good information on it.
Definitely. Yeah, all of our Highland Lakes here. What else do we have here? So we got a question. I think this would be following up with something that Dr. Manning mentioned earlier. Could the algae be removed by mechanical means? I know we talked about some of the chemical strategies that we're seeing around the country, but anything else that could be done?
Yeah, so you know, I was kind of joking around with Brent last summer when we were seeing these mats form because, you know, didn't want to throw any chemical at that particular, you know, bloom because we released all those compounds. So again, I joked, I'm like, get somebody out there on a paddle board and just had them skim up all of that material. So essentially, you know, instead of having, you know, a person on a paddleboard, there are mechanical harvesters that would allow to, you know, pull the surface material off of the lake, but it would just take quite a bit of time to actually do that. And it just depends on the amount of coverage, because last year we were seeing, you know, 70–80% coverage of the water surface around Ladybird or around Redbud Isle. So that would be a full-time job for somebody. But then again, as it moves downstream, again, that may not be practical. So there are mechanisms in place, you know, either people-powered or some type of instrument or machine.
Yeah, but also important to remember that it starts growing on the bottom and then floats up. So it would only be removing the stuff that's floating on top. It wouldn't necessarily get rid of what's causing the problem in the first place. So it's kind of, it might remove an immediate risk from a dog playing there though.
That's a good point. Yeah, interesting ideas out there for this. Something that I just thought of when you mentioned what the coverage looked like last summer. How does that compare to this summer? Like so far, is it worse this summer, about the same? How does it compare to last year? Brent?
My observations, it's probably been about the same. There's a lot of variability because these floating mats are kind of at the whim of releases from the Tom Miller Dam and our prevailing winds. So they do move around a lot. They get caught up in backwaters and underneath tree lines and along shorelines. So over the 2 months that we've been monitoring, there has been a lot of fluctuation. I would say that at its peak, it was probably pretty close to last year. Some of the pictures that Liz and other colleagues took around Redbud Isle on the east side, kind of more on the dam side, there was actually more growth and kind of biomass accumulation over there last year than what I saw this year. So something a little different, something changed on the west side of Redbud Isle, though. You know, my direct observations have been about similar. So again, it's a tough thing because it's so dynamic. These things can move around so much that it's hard to get a handle on exactly how much biomass. It's not like grabbing a scoop of water and getting a concentration. So that's something that we're still trying to figure out is a good way to quantify how much mass is out there in these areas.
Gotcha. And is there
one thing?
Go ahead.
The one thing that has changed this year is that there have been some toxins detected lower down in the basin than last year.
Yeah.
So last year the basin seemed to be fairly clear based on the samples that we had taken, but this year there are some hits in the algae down there, and I don't know if that's starting there or just floating from upstream, but you know, it seems to go further downstream than it did last year.
Interesting. Well, like you said, we're all connected, so yeah, something to think about. Is there a correlation between the locations that we're seeing these masses and, I mean, the fact that we're seeing them around Redbud Isle, which is an off-leash dog park, kind of the worst place for that to happen, and we had those unfortunate events with dogs last year, but is that a reason why the algae is hanging out over there?
It's one of those things. It's almost like the COVID testing. If you look for it, you're probably going to find it. So we are targeting these areas because they are popular with recreational users and with dogs. But that's not to say that there's not masses of algae growing in plenty of other areas that, you know, where there's no dog traffic or other activity. We just happen to be looking in those areas. So it's you know, you can't discount the contribution of animal waste to the event. But again, if we looked other places, if we took samples in other spots, it's very likely we would find these algae. And as Liz mentioned, you know, if you know, below I-35, there was a tremendous amount of algae growing this year, and we were getting low levels of toxins being detected in those mats, even in areas kind of separate and where you don't get nearly as much dog traffic and activity. So.
Interesting. Thank you for answering that. We have another question here. I'm going to do my best. I believe this is from someone who has more scientific knowledge on the topic, so forgive me if I mispronounce any of this. We got a question asking the panel to comment on the effects of acute macrophyte reduction via biological means. And I'm not sure if this is all part of the same question, but downstream macronutrient transport due to mechanical nutrient suspension, nutrient sink removal, and sediment destabilizing on cyanobacteria prevalence.
I'll take that one. What they're very tactfully referring to is the loss of hydrilla in Lake Austin, and the fact that that we do not have this very effective, you know, kind of nutrient sink upriver of Lady Bird Lake. Submerged aquatic vegetation is something that's very good at sequestering sediments, at sequestering nutrients. For hydrilla, they primarily get their nutrients from the sediments, though. So the impact that they are having on nutrients in the water column could be debated. Given our flow velocities out here, the short residence times, or, you know, changing residence times, macrophyte impacts on Lake Austin, that would require a lot more study. Ladybird Lake has generally been devoid of aquatic vegetation. The last drought period, there was a proliferation of kabamba, native plant. We do get some, it looks like a aquatic plant, but it's actually an algae. It's called Cara muskgrass. It doesn't root, so it's taking its nutrients from the water column. That is also growing out there. So you do have some competition with the cyanobacteria. You know, we are looking at the question though for that kind of interbasin transport of nutrients is something that we're curious about. The Tom Miller Dam is a bottom release dam. So right above there, you have the deepest part of Lake Austin that is absent of vegetation. And in the summer, this time of year, you get stratification. So you get layers that form based on water temperature density gradients. And the bottom waters lose all of their oxygen because it's not being mixed with the atmosphere. When you lose the oxygen, you can release sediments from the you can release nutrients from the sediments. Those nutrients then would be flushed through the dam right there to Redbud Isle. So again, so this is a potential source of nutrients helping to feed these blooms in Ladybird Lake. But again, being in the basin, that would be completely decoupled from aquatic vegetation, management losses or other things, you know, in the upper part of the reservoir where hydrilla tended to proliferate. But these are questions that we are asking and trying to pursue in our research.
Awesome. Thank you for explaining that. I actually understand what you're saying. I did miss part of that question about reduction via biological means, including grass carp. Is that?
Yes, it was a AAA grass carp of control of hydrilla was, yes.
Gotcha. Okay. Let's see here. I think we've gotten through most of the audience questions that we have right now. So let me just ask y'all kind of as we're wrapping this up, is there anything else that y'all think people should know about these harmful algae blooms? You know, we know they can check the websites. We've got those resources for them for people to read up on more, but just kind of wrap up our discussion today. Any final thoughts on the blue-green algae harmful blooms?
Well, I do think that it's important to note that this is probably something that is going to be an issue going into the future. So it's something that people can expect. We've got the program. Brent's going to start looking every year, starting in June, to try to detect when the year's bloom will occur. We'll have that information up every year now that we know what we're dealing with, and we're going to be looking at models to see if we can better predict when it's going to happen. But I think that from midsummer to mid-fall are going to be the high risk seasons, and so if people just start to understand that is an issue, be aware of what's going on. We're not going to be in every creek and every lake, so just make sure that you're looking to see what kind of water is present where you're planning to have fun, with your dog or your family. Just be aware of what's going on and stay away from algae.
Gotcha. Thank you, Liz. Anything else?
Yeah, I guess to kind of build on that, looking into the future, and, even as we've moved, considering the future from 10 years ago, the global occurrences of harmful algal blooms has increased dramatically in water bodies, and it's temperate, subtropical, tropical climates all over the world. And these are things that are related to how we're managing our watersheds and how we're impacting the global climate. So as we get more droughts, as we get larger punctuated rain events that scour and erode and flood our rivers, bringing a lot of sediment and nutrient load into our systems, followed by prolonged droughts and dry and hot spells. These are all things that fuel these blooms, and our activities can either work to mitigate that or we can exacerbate it. So again, good stewardship in our watersheds, leaving buffer strips, planting native drought-resistant plants, trying your best to control and treat stormwater on site, regardless of how big your property is, minimizing fertilizer, like Liz said before. All these things will make an impact as these phenomena, keep expanding in the future.
Scoop the poop.
And the good thing is now we know kind of the cast of characters who are there, so we can start to be a bit more predictive, especially with genetic data. So we can actually take a whole sample and try to see who is there and try to predict if we might have a bloom coming up. So during the bloom season, we do a lot of extractions of the current algae that is there. So over the fall and the winter break, while the blooms are not there, we can do the genetics work to start to build that reference library to start looking at how to model what's going forward.
Awesome. Well, a big thank you to City of Austin Watershed Protection Department and people like Dr. Manning here at the labs at UT Austin for doing this work and protecting this precious area of our Colorado River Basin. And thank you to y'all today for being here on our virtual panel. I certainly learned a lot about our algae blooms and cyanobacteria. And if people want to continue, or if you are watching this recorded back sometime in the future, you can still send us questions. Again, check out the WPD website and those resources that were mentioned. Just to plug, our next Colorado River Alliance River Reflections will be on September 17th, and the topic will be women in STEM. So be sure to tune into that one as well. Again, a huge thank you to our panelists today, Dr. Bellinger, Dr. Manning, Liz, Johnston. Thank you guys so much, and keep doing your good work out there.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, Katie.
I think you got 2 of your panelists already for your next next webinar.
There's plenty.
Thing that we've realized is there is a wealth of women in STEM out there that we've been talking to. So we're very excited about that.
Great.
Awesome.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.